Hello and welcome to our interview with Professor Ana Llinares, who's Vice Chair of the COST Action CLIL NetLE, and she's a leading authority on CLIL. My name is Mária Bakti, and I will interview Ana about her work in CLIL. Ana is a full professor at the Department of English Philology of the University of Madrid, and she's also the principal investigator of the university's CLIL research group. So my first question is, when or how did your research attention turn to CLIL?
Yes, well, thank you for this opportunity, Maria. Actually, I started working on CLIL quite a long time ago already. In fact, when I worked on my PhD, that was in the late 1990s, I defended my PhD in 2002. My focus was on young learners, very young learners, spoken production in English classes, right? I'm talking about, when in Spain there was a lot of initiatives of starting learning English at a very early age. So first grade, first year of primary, and even preschool. So I was interested in looking at the potential opportunities for these very young learners to be able to use English as a second language, right? For purposes other than learning vocabulary or singing songs, right? Which was what most of teaching focused on. So I looked at the meaning-making potential of little children, trying to see whether when they were presented with situations where they had to produce language to convey certain functions, like, for example, when they needed something to be done for them, or when they needed some information, or when they needed to express some personal issues, whether that enhanced their production of a second language. So from those days already, I was interested in the meaning-making potential of learning languages, and in particular, in this case, English, but it could be any languages. And that's how I got interested in applying models that look at language as inseparable from the meanings that language conveys, right? And then I went a little bit further up in the school sort of educational in the educational levels, and I became more interested in looking at how students learn language in integration with content in bilingual schools, where different subjects are taught and learned through a second language, in this case, English. So it was like this gradual movement from always an interest in language as a meaning-making tool, and then moving into higher educational levels where content becomes more abstract and more sort of difficult for students, and how language can be learned in integration with the content.
And language integrated with content is what CLIL is, but at the same time, there are several definitions and several approaches to it. How would you define CLIL, or how do you see CLIL?
Yes, I've always been aware, as everybody else involved in CLIL research and pedagogy, of multiple meanings of a use of the term CLIL, content and language integrated learning. Basically, because it's been used from the beginning, it was used with the idea of an approach, a pedagogical approach to integrate content and languages, mainly foreign or second languages, but any language in any type of context. But then gradually, CLIL became very, very popular, first in Europe and then in many other countries of the world. And then different types of CLIL have been applied in different contexts. So we have as many definitions of CLIL as programs you can find, not only in different countries, but also within the same country. If I give the example of my own context, Spain, there are different programs in different regional communities, autonomous communities, and even in one specific autonomous communities, there can be different CLIL programs coexisting with different characteristics, different types of models of exposure, level of exposure to the teaching of subjects in English or in other languages, also the languages that are involved. So I would be, in order to sort of try to make sense of CLIL as a common term, let's say, that we can adopt, I think it's important to focus on the CLIL as approach rather than as program, because as I said, different programs are called CLIL, but they sometimes have not so much in common, and maybe some CLIL programs have more in common with the so-called immersion programs in Canada, for example, or CBI programs in the States. So I would tend to focus on CLIL as an approach that can be implemented in any context, any country, and with different languages being involved.
Thank you. And this brings us to your research on CLIL that you've carried out in collaboration with colleagues in different parts of Europe and the world. And these includes Spain, Finland, and Japan, very diverse contexts. Where do you see the most important similarities and differences in CLIL in these contexts? You have already touched upon Spain, but we have Finland and Japan and other parts of the world.
Yes, thank you. Well, this is what is exciting about, and I can be very thankful, the opportunities that I've had to collaborate and also participate at conferences and events in different parts of the world. And in particular, if we think of specifically these three contexts, because as I said before, we cannot talk about all the contexts as different, they all have their own specificities. But the main difference between, let's say, for example, if we think of Spain and Finland, European context, in contrast with Japan, the main difference is the application of CLIL as, there is this distinction between what is called hard CLIL and soft CLIL, which mainly refers to, for hard CLIL, using the content subject as the starting point and then integrating a focus on language in the content subjects, right? Whereas the soft CLIL is integrating content in the language class. And the main difference is that most CLIL programs or CLIL implementations in Spain are of a hard CLIL type. So in other words, the lessons are scheduled as content lessons, history, biology, geography, and then these lessons are taught through a second language, and the CLIL approach means that there is also a focus on the second language in an integration with the content. In the Japanese context, there are language classes, and then content is integrated in the language classes, so that language is addressed with a meaning and content-oriented approach. So at the end of the day, what we're doing is in both cases, integrating content and language, but the difference is what the basis is, if it's the language class or if it's the content class. The similarities across these two, let's say, continents, or Japan and then the European context mainly has to do with, the similarities is that we're looking at content and language in an integrated manner, and mainly we look at language as separate, separate and not separable from the meanings and content that language expresses. But the difference is it's different when we incorporate content in a language class from when we incorporate the language, a focus on the language in the content class. And then mainly between Finland and Spain, there are, differences in the sense that although things are changing, Finnish students traditionally have been more exposed in particular if we think of English to English outside the classroom, right? So more exposure in terms of, access to, for example, the TV or video games or any other activities outside the classroom, whereas in Spain, traditionally, those activities have been carried out in Spanish. Things are changing now, and English is becoming more and more part of the lives of students in Spain as well. And also, I think in Spain, the initiatives, particularly in some communities, have been very big, like with many teachers and schools involved. In some communities that are already bilingual, such as, for example, Catalonia or the Basque Country, the initiatives on CLIL with foreign languages have been less big, let's say, because of course they need to incorporate two official languages already, so Spanish and Basque, Catalan or Galician, whereas in monolingual communities such as Madrid and Andalusia, they only have one official language. Okay, and in Finland, in Finland, they already have to incorporate Swedish, not only Finnish. So the programs have been a little bit smaller and are more based on individual initiatives from schools, whereas in Spain, they are programs that are designed by educational authorities and sort of incorporate many schools. So these are mainly the differences in terms of the types of programs, I would say.
Thank you. And so it's clear that you've carried out collaboration with international colleagues, but you're also the leader of the CLIL research group of the Universidad Autónoma of Madrid. So tell us a little bit about the research you're doing in your research group.
Yes, I mean, we have been working on content and language integration, and what do we mean by that, for many years already in different programs in Spain. Some years ago, we looked at the Madrid bilingual education program, and we were interested in the transition from primary to secondary school. Okay, looking at students and teachers' perceptions and beliefs, also at students' oral and written production when they're writing or talking about different content topics in English. We've been interested in looking at whether there is a difference between the students' performance on the same topic, responding to the same function in English when they do it in English or when they do it in their first language, in Spanish. We've seen that when students struggle to define or to describe or to express some judgment, they do it not only when they write or talk about whatever topic in the second language, but also in Spanish. So it seems that the language is not the main deterrent, let's say. When students are able to define in English, they show that they're able to also do it in Spanish, even though they haven't probably, or they haven't defined so often certain topics in Spanish because they've always followed those classes in English. So it seems that there is transfer from one language to another, at least in terms of functions, right? I'm not talking about grammar or vocabulary. I'm talking about being able to explain, define, etc. We've used Christiane Dalton-Puffer's cognitive discourse function model a lot, and she's also a member of our research group, and she's participated in the projects that we have coordinated here from Spain, from a One CLIL group. So we've looked at this transition from primary to secondary, and then we've looked at the same students developmentally and looked at throughout secondary school. And now at the moment we're looking at we're focusing on students from another program, not the Madrid program, but another bilingual program in Spain, which is a joint venture between the British Council and the Ministry of Education with schools in different parts of Spain. So there we're interested in looking at the role of a socioeconomic area of where the schools are located, and also the socioeconomic status of the students that participate in those programs, and how this correlates or not with the actual results that the students have in their written production. We're only focusing on the written production. And another, I think, innovative aspect that we look at is that we relate these to teachers, to the content teachers and English teachers' assessment of the students' text. So we look at how students define, how students explain scientific concept, how students explore possibilities, hypotheses on a history topic or whatever. But we relate that to what teachers, content teachers and English teachers perceive as a good answer or as a not so good answer. So we are sort of taking teachers very much in perspective in this new sort of stage of a research project that we are involved in.
That's very exciting and a very complex look at CLIL. And you also mentioned writing, the written production of students or pupils in the CLIL program. Now, most studies in CLIL confirm a CLIL advantage in speaking, but there hasn't been really decisive results related to written production. So could you sum up some of your findings in this respect, the written production CLIL advantage, if there's such a thing?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I forgot to say that one of our variables that we focused on, because I mentioned there's comparison between the students' production in the second language and in the first language, right, and see whether there were differences or not. We also compared the students' production on the same topic, responding to the same question orally and in writing. And what we found is that it was quite interesting to see that when they were writing, they tended to be more canonical in the way they express the content that they were expected to deliver. So in other words, they were more similar. They were performing more similarly to what would be expected, for example, from a textbook, or what teachers usually expect the students to perform. Whereas when they were doing it orally, the language was less scientific, maybe less abstract, but the students produced longer turns, so they used more. They had like more chances to show how much they knew about the content. So for us, this was an interesting result, because it shows that it is important at schools to sort of try to encourage students to express their knowledge in both modes, right? Because in the spoken mode, okay, so the language is not so academic, but they were able to expand more on what they were saying. Also the teacher, and in these discussions, there were questions that helped students to elaborate on what they were saying, and they were able to show better what they knew. But on the other hand, the language was maybe not as it would be expected by the teachers. In writing, they were more formal, they were more academic, but to what extent have they not learned what they're writing by heart? This is an interesting question. I mean, I want to clarify that the type of research that we've been doing in the CLIL research group is we've used mainly functional approaches, mainly systemic functional linguistics, where we look at lexicogrammar, but never as something separate from meanings and functions, right? So we've looked at, for example, when we look at definitions, we've looked at the types of expansions. If students just stick to, well, first of all, if they stick to the core definition, or if they add a bit more and expand, and then what types of expansions, if they are examples, or if they are clarifications. And then at the last stage is where we look at the lexicogrammar. So what are they actually, what kind of grammar are they using? But we're less interested in accuracy than in complexity and the actual sort of functional use of a language, because I think this is something that particularly content teachers are more interested in. When content teachers say we're not language teachers, what they mean actually is that we're not teachers of grammar, we're not teachers of vocabulary or something sort of separate, but they are actually English teachers. Of course they are, because language plays a role in whatever we learn. So yeah, so I hope I've answered the question.
Oh yes, thank you. Yes, and in some of your answers, functions and a functional approach, language functions, it has come up, and this could take us to the next question, and that is the COST Action CLIL NetLE, which looks at disciplinary literacies and CLIL. So how do you see the place of this action in the overall CLIL scene or CLIL landscape?
Yes, no, this action is key for the development of research on CLIL. When we talk about CLIL, we're talking about, of course, the language of the disciplines. We cannot separate the two, right? Because right at the beginning, there was an interest in seeing whether CLIL students or students who studied languages through subjects and that were more exposed to the language than students in non-CLIL context, whether their language proficiency, their general language proficiency was better, improved compared to the language proficiency of those students who studied languages just as a subject, right, in a non-CLIL context. But now the interest has moved beyond that, and the interest is in how languages are learned through content, right? So not so much about general language proficiency, but more about also whether the students can really perform well and learn well the content that they are expected to learn at school if they do it in a second language or a foreign language compared to doing it in your first language, right? So an action like CLIL NetLE with so many contexts, countries, different ways of implementation of disciplinary literacies or focus on literacies in different languages, I think it's key, because very rarely you find this opportunity of comparing so many contexts, so obtaining insights from so many contexts. This, of course, is very challenging, because how do you put together all these different specificities? But the aim is that we can come up with some general insights in terms of conceptualizing multi-disciplinary literacies, at least in Europe. But at the same time, being able to apply that conceptual framework to a specific context, to the local specificities of a context. So this is a big challenge. But coming up with a framework and good drawing on good practices and insights from different contexts, I think can be. It is not easy to find frameworks that are really that really draw on a variety of contexts, and then the challenge is, how do we then apply them once we have come up with insights on, for example, descriptors of different subject areas or curricular analysis, and we get general insights. How do we then go back to the local context and address specificities, and at the same time come up with overarching ideas?
So we can agree that CLIL NetLE is a very innovative new approach, or a new way rather, of looking at CLIL. Now, where else, what other key topics are there in CLIL today? You've mentioned some of the things your research group is doing. So what are some of the other key issues or topics in CLIL today, in your opinion?
Right. This is a very interesting question. I think every specific or topic in CLIL cannot be detached from disciplinary literacies, because this is but when we talk about disciplinary literacies, we can look at the students, actual students production. We can look at stakeholders' perspective. I said earlier that in one of the projects that we developed here in Spain, we looked at the transition from primary to secondary. I think it's very, very important to also look at the transition from secondary to tertiary. And CLIL NetLE has started looking at that in one of the working groups, in working group 5. There is this focus on tertiary professors or lecturers' perspectives of what they expect the students from secondary school to bring to the university in terms of their training in disciplinary literacies. I think more research has to go there and more work. So this is just the beginning, I think, and I think I would argue that we need to work more on the transition from secondary to tertiary. And definitely the topic of equity or inequity of CLIL, there are different studies, and they show, some studies show that CLIL can sort of level the differences, the socioeconomic impact that affects students in learning at school in general. Other studies say that CLIL is in the end only for the students that whose families are more supportive and whose families are more interested in languages. And what about the other students? So there is this diversity of and I think all the studies are right. I mean, the question is, how do we then, once we identify that some programs lead to equity and other CLIL programs lead to inequity, then let's try to sort of apply those or expand those programs that are actually working in reducing inequity. So, for example, one of the potential advantages of CLIL with migrant populations in different European countries is try to use the fact that if a second language is used for the teaching, then all the students, the local students, but also the students coming from other countries will be in the same condition, in the same sense that all of them will be working on a second language, right? Anyway, so all these kind of aspects need to be explored further. So I would say transition from different educational levels and equity. And a third aspect, I think, is more it's that we have started incorporating in our research group here in Spain, is the participation of teachers. So collaborative work between content teachers and English teachers, but also between teachers, well, English teachers or any language teachers, not necessarily English, but also with content and language teachers and researchers, and actually make teachers, so allow teachers, or no, allow is not a good verb, engage teachers in research, right, in field research. So not just teachers participating in research studies carried out by researchers, but actual teachers, content teachers and language teachers participating in research studies. I think this is key. And in fact, this is one of targets in Sustainable Development Goal of quality education, in the United Nations Quality Education Sustainable Development Goal, which highlights the importance of teamwork in education. So teamwork for me is not just students working in teams, but teachers, content in CLIL, particularly content teachers and language teachers working together, but also with the research community. I think this is a big challenge.
Thank you, Anna. It was really an enriching experience talking to you, and thank you for your answers, which lead to further and newer questions. And I wish you good luck in your work. And that's the end of our interview.
Thank you very much, Maria. The questions have been really, really very relevant. So thanks very much for organizing this interview.